In this lesson, we are going to be discussing appropriate approaches and mechanisms to keep in mind when we are discussing IT security policy frameworks. And so in information technology, the security policy framework is in place in order to be able to support the business and legal obligations and objectives of the organization. So the security policy framework is important because it needs to be able to encompass and uplift the core values of the organization. And so essentially, this framework is what we're going to use in order to define how an organization is going to be able to effectively and efficiently identify, manage, and dispose of risks. So one of the core objectives to keep in mind with the security framework is that you need to make sure that you're able to establish appropriate cultural beliefs and mechanisms with regards to security so that the organization's risk is minimized. So selecting an appropriate security framework is important. And there are a number of different frameworks that can be taken into consideration. And so in order to understand that, it's important to keep in mind the interests of the organization, of leadership, and how regulators will view the framework and how the organization has adopted the framework to deal with risk and other threats. And so when we develop a security framework, what we want to do is ensure that we take a systematic way to not only identify, but also mitigate and be able to reduce those risks accordingly. And so as data comes into the organization from either end users or through files or other components or interactions, it's important that the organization have complete control over how to deal with potential risk, and that those extrinsic internal security controls are in place to handle things appropriately. So with the framework in place, this allows for the enterprise to continue on in the business to operate as normal without being affected by risk. And so there are a few different things that we need to keep in mind, specifically in talking about developing a appropriate IT security policy framework. We want to be sure that we're able to compare security policy framework components and approaches. We also want to be sure that we're able to identify the role that an IT policy framework is going to have in place as well. So this is going to be in place in order to support core values and business objectives. Now, there are some different concepts that we also need to consider. We'll need to keep in mind different methods and best practices and approaches for our security policy framework. We'll also need to take into consideration the importance of being able to define roles and responsibilities and ensure that accountability for personnel is maintained. The framework needs to have a clear separation of duties as well. And then we're also going to need to ensure that we have importance of governance and compliance that is taken into consideration. And so in order to accomplish this, we'll need to compare and contrast multiple frameworks, identify those top security policy frameworks that we could use, and essentially we'll need to also make sure that we're able to understand the roles associated with the stakeholders in the framework. And so what do we need to consider when we are discussing a IT security policy framework. Well, the framework is going to be dependent upon a number of different factors. And it's important to keep in mind that the IT security policy framework needs to work in tandem with government agencies, corporations, and other stakeholders. So there's no clear cut framework that is going to apply for every organization and situation. So with this in mind, we need to take into consideration the industry that we're dealing with. We'll need to understand how management views and how they have been trained to handle risk. And then we'll also need to focus on any biases that might be present within the organization. Biases are important because biases provide for an opportunity for a security risk or breach to exploit the organization. And so those are some key things that we have to keep in mind when we are determining and identifying a appropriate security policy framework. And so there are various models that we can consider. There are frameworks around various industries. And so we can have a framework that's specified based off of a specific domain. So there are frameworks associated with vendor management, project management, event and incident response, being able to measure and audit properly, as well as IT risk management and IT controls and resiliency. So these are all of the various domains that are going to need to be considered in order to create an effective IT security policy framework. And so how can we ensure that we are successful in being able to support the framework? Well, we need to make sure that if a security event were to happen, then that we're able to understand what caused that event. And a security event is going to be an undesirable event that could occur within our organization that would possibly affect the day-to-day or daily operations. And so this can result in an effect on the organization by either data being exposed or someone unknowingly providing data to an individual that does not need it. There are a number of different events that could influence this. And so within our first step of coverage for our framework is we want to make sure that we are following our industry regulatory requirements. And so, for example, if we have a government agency involved, if we're dealing with federal data, then we might need to ensure that we're following the Federal Information Security Measurement Act. FISMA was developed in 2002. And it is a federal regulatory act. We can also need to make sure that auditors and regulators are in compliance as well. And so there are different organizations that can be involved with this as well. So next we can focus on some of the different things to consider when we're working with customer data. So again, we need to review industry regulatory requirements, look to auditors and regulators as well. And then we'll also want to select a framework that is going to provide broad support for the industry over time. And so our previous table provided us with a number of different models that we needed to keep into consideration for a fully comprehensive framework. And so some of the ways in which we can work with our frameworks, we can use our committee of sponsoring organizations. And so that is a framework that was developed for validating internal controls and managing enterprise risks. And it's heavily focused on financial operations as well as risk management. We could also consider COBIT. COBIT was developed by the Information Systems Audit and Control Association. And essentially, COBIT provides a framework and a supporting tool set that can be utilized to align with business and control requirements for specific technical issues. Now, so some things to keep in mind is that COBIT is an international governance and control framework, and it's going to be widely utilized and accepted for allowing for standard accessing, governing, and managing of IT security and risk. And so with COBIT, it is essentially an extension of several other initiatives from the Information Systems Audit and Control Association, or ISACA. And so they focus on IT risk management. And so this can provide for an extension of COBIT and for IT risk. And so COBIT maps to many of the major frameworks that are available as well, such as COSO, ISO, and ITIL as well. ISO is one of the more popular standardization bodies, and they have a approach for IT security policy. And so ISO, which is short or stands for the International Organization for Standardization, is going to provide a framework approach that relates to information security as well as IT risk. And so it's going to be one of the most widely accepted standards because it produces an array of standards that can support a number of different industries and business models. And so with this in mind, the ISO standards provide for appropriate access to information security and IT risk, and that have been identified by leading international standards. And so there are a number of different ISO publications that provide for appropriate frameworks. And so you have ISO 20000, which focuses on IT security, IT service management systems. You have ISO 27001, which focuses on information security management. You also have other components that are available as well, such as the ISO 27002, and that focuses on the code of practice for information security management as well. Other frameworks from organization includes the Information Technology Infrastructure Library. And so this provides a library and approach for international frameworks that provides best practices for delivering IT services. We also have the NIST framework. NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and it's used to provide federal information processing standards, and these can be required by FISMA. You also have the PCI DSS Payment Card Security Standards Council. They provide a security framework for any organization that accepts, stores, or processes credit cards. And then you also have the CIS Critical Security Controls for Effective Cyber Defense. This was first developed in 2008 by the SANS Institute. And so now it is actually managed by the Center for Information Security. And it provides for a number of different ways to maintain and control security mechanisms over the internet. So this is just a short list of available frameworks that can be utilized. And it's important to keep in mind that using a combination of these frameworks can provide for a comprehensive approach to maintain the business operations and security of an organization. So using these in combination, it helps to maintain security and risk minimization as well. So it's important to keep in mind that these frameworks are commonly adopted across industry and can be used as articles of best practice. And so typically it's going to be a combination of various frameworks that are tailored towards the industry as well as the organizational culture. A key component or thing to keep in mind is to make sure that the frameworks maintain their ability to be flexible as well. And then that, each organization is going to have, each framework is going to have benefits to the organization that need to be studied in detail. And so one approach to take is to use a risk management and compliance approach. Using this approach, it allows for the deliver of value to a framework, and it allows for things to be managed and disposed of on a daily basis. And what we mean by disposal of risk, well, once a risk is identified, we need to decide what to do about it and how to dispose of it. And so that can be done in a number of different ways. We need to accept, transfer, avoid, or mitigate that risk accordingly. So it's important to keep in mind that many frameworks can share some characteristics. So they might be risk-based, they might speak to the organization's risk appetite, and they could deal with operation disruption and losses appropriately. So those are some different things that you have to consider when you're trying to identify and effectively utilize a framework with your organization. And a key measurement to also keep into consideration will be the cost of the risk mitigation. So if the risk becomes too big for the business that it's going to cause a loss in operations, then that should be a high focus. We want a framework that places a high focus on the risk that on minimizing risk to the organization, because in these instances, we have to consider that the business objectives, legal obligations, and the organization's value are maintained. The ISA-CA Risk IT Framework process model is a model that's built on 3 different domains. And so these different domains all help to ensure that the business objectives continue for the organization. And so these are based off of the domains of risk governance, meaning that we want to ensure that the domain provides the business view and context for risk. And so this means that we need to make risk-aware business decisions. We need to be sure that we are able to establish and maintain a common risk view and integrate with our ERM. We also need to have appropriate risk evaluation. So this ensures that risks are identified and presented to leadership in business terms. And then we also need to have appropriate risk response. And this ensures that risks are reduced and remediated in the most cost-effective manner. So each of these domains have to work in tandem to ensure that we maintain flexibility and agility for the organization. And so each framework that is chosen is going to need to ensure that it's going to be able to maintain appropriate governance, evaluation, as well as an appropriate response for any risks or problems that are likely to occur.